The Sanctum Spire was where interstellar bureaucrats sent their dreams to die. It was an orbital tower that only a severely disgruntled engineer could love, an upside-down, skyscraping monstrosity that hung over the planet Dalron like a migraine-inducing chandelier. One might dare to call it a marvel of human ingenuity, but only if they were on a diet of delusion and cheap space whiskey. Captain Rylan Voss, with his face permanently set to skeptical, stood on the observation deck, leaning against a console that hummed like a dying cat. "I swear, if one more alien ship shows up uninvited, I'm charging them rent," he muttered. His crew, a mismatched group of opportunists and misfits, were sprawled around him in various states of disinterest. First Mate Griggs, a man whose loyalty was as questionable as his hygiene, looked up from his data pad. "Captain, if we're charging rent, I want my cut. I'm still waiting on last month's bonus," Ryland snorted. "Your bonus was me not spacing you after that incident with the reactor core and the banana peel." Griggs opened his mouth to retort, but the console pinged ominously. "Incoming transmission." "Should we answer or just pretend we're not home?" Rylan asked, only half joking. "Might be the pizza," muttered Ilara, their resident engineer and professional pessimist. She was elbow-deep in the guts of some ancient piece of tech that probably belonged in a museum, if it didn't explode first, of course. Rylan tapped the console, and a hologram flickered to life, displaying a stern, gray-faced officer whose uniform was so crisp it could slice bread. "Captain Voss, this is Admiral Stratham of the United Earth Fleet," the hologram declared, voice dripping with the kind of authority that comes from never having to clean your own toilet. "Admiral," Rylan acknowledged, trying not to roll his eyes. "To what do we owe the pleasure?" cut the chatter Voss. "We have a situation. The Sanctum Spire is under siege by the Kragari. They're not just after the tower, they are after something inside it." Griggs muttered under his breath. "What is it with evil aliens and their obsession with space architecture?" The Admiral ignored him, focusing on Rylan. "We have intel suggesting that there's a relic hidden within the spire." "A relic that might tip the balance in this war," Rylan crossed his arms. "And you want us to fetch it?" "Precisely. Just to clarify, do you mean fetch as in risk our necks and get shot at by alien psychopaths, or fetch as in you order room service and we deliver?" "I'm sure you'll figure it out," the Admiral replied with a smile that could melt steel if the steel was made of butter. "Why us?" Ilara piped up, twisting a wrench into something that made a noise like a small animal in distress. "Because you're expendable," Stratham said, not missing a beat. Rylan grinned. "I love how you sugarcoat things." "Do this job and you'll be well rewarded," Stratham promised, the sort of vague assurance that usually precedes a spectacular betrayal. "We'll consider it," Rylan replied, cutting the transmission before the Admiral could say anything more. He turned to his crew, who were watching him with varying degrees of skepticism and mock horror. "So, who's up for a suicidal relic hunt?" he asked, trying to muster some enthusiasm. "I hate relics," Ilara said, tossing her wrench aside. "They always come with curses or some other cosmic nonsense." "Well, some people go to therapy to face their fears. We go to alien-infested towers," Griggs quipped. Rylan clapped his hands together. "All right, let's prep the ship. And remember, if you see any Kragari, just smile and wave." The crew dispersed to their stations, each grumbling in their own way. As Rylan headed to the cockpit, he couldn't shake the feeling that this mission was going to be one of those character-building experiences that people talked about but never actually wanted. The Sanctum Spire loomed larger as they approached, its metallic skin reflecting the harsh light of Dalron's sun. It looked like a giant middle finger aimed at the universe. As they neared the docking bay, the ship's sensors beeped a warning. "Looks like we have company," Ilara announced over the intercom, her voice crackling with static. "Kragari fighters, 3 o'clock. "Great, they brought friends," Rylan muttered, adjusting his grip on the controls. "Griggs, warm up the turrets. Time to show them our hospitality." Griggs's voice came through, tinged with the excitement of someone who found joy in chaos. "Turrets are hot and ready, Captain." Let's give him a warm welcome. The ship shuddered as the first volley of fire lashed out, lighting up the void like fireworks on a budget. Ryland maneuvered the vessel with the finesse of a man who'd spent more time dodging bounty hunters than he cared to admit. "I hope this relic is worth it," Ryland said, more to himself than anyone else. "What are we looking for exactly?" Ilara's voice had that edge of curiosity that suggested she was already mentally disassembling whatever ancient doodad they were supposed to find. "Something shiny and important, I guess," Ryland replied, which was about as good a description as any. The Kragari ships veered off, their pilots deciding that discretion was the better part of valor, or maybe they just had lousy aim. Either way, Ryland wasn't complaining. As they docked with the towering edifice, the sense of foreboding was palpable. Stepping out onto the deck of the Sanctum Spire was like entering a mausoleum that someone had tried to brighten up with fluorescent lights. Shadows clung to every corner, and the air was thick with the scent of stale bureaucracy. "All right, team," Ryland said, trying to project confidence he didn't feel. "Let's get this over with." They moved cautiously through the corridors, weapons ready, eyes scanning for movement. It wasn't long before they stumbled upon the aftermath of a skirmish, scorch marks on the walls, the scent of burnt ozone in the air, and the occasional piece of alien anatomy strewn about like Thanksgiving leftovers. "Looks like the Kragari have been busy," Griggs remarked, nudging a severed limb with his boot. "Let's hope they're too busy to notice us," Ilara said, her fingers twitching over the button of her plasma pistol. "Wishful thinking," Ryland muttered. "Our luck's never been that good." They pressed on, navigating the labyrinthine passages with all the grace of a drunken octopus. The deeper they went, the more the walls seemed to close in, as if the tower itself resented their presence. Finally, they reached a door that practically screamed important stuff inside. It was locked, of course, because nothing worth having is ever easy to get. "Ilara," Ryland said, gesturing to the control panel beside the door. "Think you can work your magic?" Ilara grinned, the kind of grin that usually accompanied some level of destruction. "Always," she said, pulling out a device that looked suspiciously like a repurposed toaster. "You know, if this goes south, I'm blaming you," Griggs said, watching her work. "If this goes south, you'll be too dead to complain," Ilara shot back, tongue poking out in concentration. There was a spark, a curse, and then a click. The door slid open with a reluctant groan, revealing a room bathed in an eerie blue light. In the center, on a pedestal that seemed to defy all architectural logic, was the relic. It was a cube, covered in intricate engravings that glowed faintly, pulsating like a heartbeat. "Well, that's anticlimactic," Ryland said, approaching the artifact with a sense of trepidation. "I was expecting something with more spikes." Ilara moved closer, her eyes wide with wonder. "It's beautiful," she whispered, reaching out as if to touch it. "Careful," Ryland warned. "For all we know, it could explode or summon an interdimensional demon." Griggs snorted. "Or worse, a committee." Ryland gingerly picked up the cube, half expecting it to do something dramatic like sing an ancient song or shoot lasers. It did neither, just sat there, heavy and silent. "All right, folks," he said, tucking the relic under his arm like a particularly inconvenient football. "Let's get the hell out of here before the Kragari decide they want their toy back." As they made their way back to the ship, the tension was palpable. Every shadow seemed to hide a threat, every distant sound a promise of danger. But they moved quickly, propelled by the kind of reckless determination that only a fool or a relic hunter could muster. The docking bay was eerily quiet, the kind of quiet that usually meant trouble was brewing. Ryland and his crew hurried aboard their ship, sealing the hatch with a satisfying hiss. "Prepping for takeoff," Ilara called, her fingers flying over the controls with practiced ease. The engines roared to life and the ship lifted off, leaving the Sanctum Spire behind like a bad memory. As they soared into the void, Ryland allowed himself a moment of relief. "Well," Griggs said, leaning back in his seat. "That was almost too easy." Ryland laughed, a sound devoid of humor. "Yeah, let's hope it stays that way." But deep down, he knew better. In the world of relic hunters, nothing was ever easy. And the real trouble had a way of sneaking up when you least expected it. The crew settled into their routines, the adrenaline of the mission fading into the background hum of the ship. But Rylan couldn't shake the feeling that they'd just poked a very dangerous bear. And knowing their luck, it wouldn't be long before it woke up, hungry and angry. But for now, they'd done the impossible, and that was enough. At least until the next crisis came knocking. The Sanctum Spire was a jigsaw puzzle designed by someone who forgot to include the picture on the box. Twisting corridors led to dead ends or backtracked into rooms that had no business existing in a sensible universe. It was like the architect was drunk and the contractor was blind, a combination that spoke volumes about whoever had commissioned the place. Rylan led the way, holding the cube like a cursed heirloom. "Anyone know how much this relic's worth?" he asked, more to break the tension than anything else. "Assuming we survive long enough to sell it, probably enough to buy a nice plot of land on a planet that doesn't try to kill you every winter," Ilara replied, scanning the walls as if she were expecting them to pull a knife. "Assuming it doesn't vaporize us first," added Griggs, who was following close behind with the sort of caution you'd expect from someone who's stepped in too many bear traps. "So, what do we think this thing actually does?" Ilara asked, curiosity getting the better of her. She had that itch to take something apart and see how it ticked, even if said something might explode. Rylan shrugged. "For all we know, it could be an intergalactic paperweight, or maybe a very deadly intergalactic paperweight. Well, whatever it is, the Kragari seem to want it bad," Griggs said, stepping over the remnants of what might have been a Kragari breakfast. "Maybe it's a universal translator for their bad taste." The air was thick with the scent of burnt wiring and desperation, a heady mix that made every breath feel like a bad decision. Rylan could almost hear the tower's groan of discomfort, as if it was aware of the chaos unfolding within its walls. "All right, keep your eyes peeled for any cryptic messages," Rylan said. "The sort of thing that's usually written in a language nobody speaks anymore." "Like Latin," Griggs suggested. "Or tax code," Ilara quipped. They pressed on, moving with the kind of coordinated clumsiness that only a crew like theirs could muster. The corridors twisted and turned, each one seemingly more nonsensical than the last. It was as if the architect had taken inspiration from a fever dream and then decided to make it reality. "Hey, over here," Ilara called, stopping in front of a wall that seemed to shimmer with an otherworldly light. Rylan joined her, squinting at the strange symbols etched into the surface. "Looks like the world's worst graffiti artist had a go, or an alien toddler," Griggs added. The symbols pulsed with a rhythm that was almost hypnotic, drawing the eye like a car crash. It was the kind of thing that screamed important in a way that also suggested dangerous. "Any idea what it says?" Rylan asked, not really expecting an answer. Ilara ran her hand over the wall, her fingers tracing the lines like a conductor leading an orchestra. "My best guess, it's a warning or an invitation. Or maybe just a really elaborate welcome home mat. Whatever it is, let's hope it doesn't trigger anything," Rylan said, stepping back as if to distance himself from the inevitable disaster. With a shrug that suggested she was just as clueless as they were, Ilara turned away from the wall. "Let's keep moving. We've got a relic to deliver and a tower to leave before it collapses on us." As they rounded another corner, they were greeted by a sight that was both unexpected and unwelcome. A squad of Kragari soldiers, their scaly skin glistening under the fluorescent lights. The Kragari commander stepped forward, teeth bared in what might have been a smile, if you were charitable or had poor eyesight. "You have something that belongs to us," he hissed, his voice like nails on a chalkboard. Rylan tightened his grip on the cube. "You mean this paperweight? Sorry, I left the receipt on the ship." The Kragari's eyes narrowed to slits. "Hand it over, human, and we might let you live," Griggs snorted. "If I had a nickel for every time someone made that promise." "Enough talk," the commander growled, raising his weapon. "We will take what is ours." Rylan glanced at Ilara, who gave a quick nod. They'd been through enough scraps to know when to fight and when to run. This was looking like the latter. "Time to go," Ryland said, backing away slowly. "You've got a plan, right?" Ilara asked, her hand inching towards her plasma pistol. "Of course," Ryland replied, lying through his teeth. "We run like hell." With that he turned and bolted down the corridor, the others hot on his heels. The Kragari followed, their footsteps pounding like an impending storm. "Faster!" Ryland shouted, not daring to look back. "The last one to the ship buys drinks for everyone else." "With what money?" Griggs hollered, but the question was lost in the chaos. They wove through the labyrinth, taking turns at random, hoping the Kragari were just as confused as they were. Every door they passed was another opportunity for escape, or a trap waiting to spring. "Left here," Ilara shouted, pointing towards a passage that seemed familiar. Ryland skidded around the corner, heart pounding like a jackhammer. He could hear the Kragari gaining, their guttural cries echoing through the corridors. "Almost there," he called, trying to keep the panic out of his voice. They burst into the docking bay, the ship waiting like a loyal dog eager to be let off its leash. Ryland's heart leaped at the sight, and for a brief moment hope kindled. "Ilara, get us airborne," he barked as they scrambled aboard. Ilara didn't need to be told twice. She dove for the controls, fingers flying over the console with the precision of someone who'd been in too many life-or-death situations to count. The ship's engines roared to life, a sound like music to Ryland's ears. The Kragari were closing in, their footsteps a relentless drumbeat. "Go, go, go," Griggs shouted, slamming the hatch shut as the first Kragari appeared at the entrance. Ilara yanked on the throttle and the ship shot forward, leaving the Sanctum Spire and their pursuers behind. The docking bay receded into the distance, swallowed by the void of space. "Well, that was invigorating," Ryland said, collapsing into the captain's chair with a sigh. "Invigorating," Griggs echoed, shaking his head. "That's what you call it." "I think I lost 10 years back there." Ilara chuckled, the tension slipping away now that they were safely beyond the reach of the Kragari. "Maybe next time we can try for a mission that doesn't involve being chased by homicidal aliens." "Where's the fun in that?" Ryland replied, giving her a wink. The ship settled into a steady course, the stars outside a blur of light. The relic sat on the console, silent and enigmatic, its mysteries yet to be unraveled. "So, what now?" Ilara asked, glancing at the cube like it might suddenly start doing tricks. Ryland leaned back, letting out a breath he'd been holding since they boarded the ship. "Now, we make sure this thing doesn't fry us in our sleep. And figure out what the Admiral's going to do when we hand it over." "You're assuming he won't try to screw us over," Griggs said, leaning against the wall with the weary resignation of a man who'd been burned too many times. Ryland shrugged. "It's a risk. But it's better than holding on to something that might get us killed. Besides," Ilara added, "I'd rather deal with a bureaucrat than an alien with a gun any day." "Agreed," Ryland said, his gaze fixed on the relic. "But let's just make sure we're ready for anything." Kragari don't strike me as the forgiving type. With a collective sigh, the crew returned to their stations, the adrenaline of the escape lingering like the aftertaste of a bad meal. The relic, for all its silence, was like a ticking clock, counting down to whatever inevitable conflict lay ahead. In the grand tradition of spacefaring crews everywhere, Ryland and his motley band of misfits prepared for the next chapter of their misadventure, with equal parts dread and anticipation. The universe had a way of throwing them curveballs, and they were determined to hit this one out of the park, or at least not get beamed in the head. As the ship hummed through the void, Ryland couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The relic might be an answer, a question, or a curse. Whichever it turned out to be, they were in it together, arguably the worst crew in the galaxy, but his crew all the same. And maybe, just maybe, they'd managed to come out of this with a few more scars, a few more stories, and just enough credits to keep flying. As the ship cruised through the star-speckled void, the crew settled into an uneasy calm, knowing that every moment brought them closer to potential doom, or at least to the inconvenient questions of Admiral Stratham. Rylan leaned back in his chair, the mysterious cube resting on the console like an inconvenient truth they were all trying to ignore. "Anyone else feel like we're a turkey on Thanksgiving Eve?" Rylan muttered, eyeing the cube like it might sprout legs and do a jig. "Turkey? That's optimistic," Griggs replied from his post, scratching at his chin with a frown that suggested his last bath was a distant memory. "More like the stuffing, if you ask me." Ilara sat cross-legged on the floor, her data pad in hand, staring at the cube like it contained the meaning of life, or at least a decent recipe for survival. "I've been scanning this thing for hours. Still can't decide if it's a paperweight or the universe's most dangerous Rubik's Cube. Maybe it's both," Ryland said. "It's always the quiet ones you gotta watch out for." The ship's console let out a whine, a noise akin to a cat slowly giving up on life, and Ilara glanced up with a sigh. "Something's off with the nav system. I swear, this ship's held together with duct tape and good intentions. More like duct tape and bad decisions," Griggs snorted, tapping a few keys. "So, any updates on what this cube does?" "Besides looking mysterious, not really," Ilara admitted. "But I think it's got a field around it, something that interacts with humor." Rylan raised an eyebrow. "That mean it laughs at bad jokes? Plot twist. It's actually a stand-up comedian," Griggs said. "We better hope the Admiral's a fan of slapstick." Ilara shook her head. "Seriously, though, the Kragari, they are interested in human culture, specifically humor. They see it as unpredictable, a threat. And somehow the cube's tied to that." Rylan ran a hand through his hair, his mind racing with the implications. "So our ace in the hole is being funny. We're screwed." "Hey, we're not that bad," Ilara protested. "Remember when Griggs tried to fix the hyperdrive and almost spaced himself?" "Yeah, hilarious," Griggs grumbled. "Comedy gold," Rylan chuckled despite himself. "All right, so the plan is to use humor. Confuse the hell out of the Kragari. Sounds like a bad sitcom or a reality show," Ilara added. "But if humor's what they don't get, maybe we can use it to keep them off balance." "Great. We'll fight them with knock-knock jokes," Griggs deadpanned. Thrilled to be on board, Rylan stood, stretching with a groan that made him feel older than he was. "Let's be ready. If humor's our weapon, we might as well polish our jokes." The ship shuddered, a gentle reminder that the universe was an unpredictable mess, and that they were just trying to survive another day in it. "Hey, Ilara," Rylan called over his shoulder as he headed to his quarters. "Find out if the Admiral's got a sense of humor. Might come in handy." "On it," Ilara replied, already tapping away at her data pad. "Though I'm betting he's more of a straight-laced bureaucrat type. Everyone's got a breaking point," Griggs said sagely. "Even bureaucrats." The ship's hum was a comforting, familiar presence, even if it did sound like it had a few screws loose. Rylan flopped onto his bunk, staring at the ceiling and wondering just how they'd gotten into this mess. But that was the thing about space. The moment you thought you had it figured out, it threw you a curveball, or in this case a cube. The next day, as they approached the coordinates where they'd meet Admiral Stratham, the tension in the ship was palpable, like a blanket that was just a bit too itchy. But Rylan had a plan. Well, not so much a plan as a collection of half-baked ideas, but that was close enough. "You ready for this?" Rylan asked, joining Ilara and Griggs in the cockpit. "No," Griggs replied, checking the settings on his console. "But that's never stopped us before." "Ilara, you've got the cube?" Rylan asked, glancing at the relic, which annoyingly refused to give up its secrets or start doing stand-up routines. "Right here," Ilara said, holding it up. "Let's hope it's in a good mood." Rylan nodded, feeling a knot form in his stomach. "All right, let's do this." As they docked with the United Earth Fleet's flagship, Rylan straightened his jacket, brushing off imaginary lint. Griggs and Ilara followed suit, though Griggs looked like he'd wrestled his clothes out of a bargain bin, which, to be fair, he probably had. "Remember," Rylan said as they marched down the corridor to meet the Admiral, "humor's our secret weapon. If things start going south, make him laugh, or cry," Griggs muttered. "Whichever comes first." The doors slid open with a hiss, revealing Admiral Stratham, who looked every bit the stern authority figure, with a haircut that could slice bread and a uniform so crisp it practically crackled. Captain Voss, Stratham greeted, giving them a nod that suggested he'd rather be anywhere else. "I trust you've brought the artifact right here," Admiral Ryland said, gesturing to Alara, who held up the cube like a prize in a rigged carnival game. Stratham's gaze flicked to the cube, then back to Ryland. "And the Kragari chased us halfway across space," Ryland replied with a grin. "But we've got a plan." Stratham arched an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. "A plan, yeah. See, the Kragari don't get humor. And this thing," Ryland nodded at the cube, "it's got something to do with that." The Admiral's expression didn't change, but Ryland thought he saw the hint of interest in those hard eyes. "Continue." "Well, we figure if they don't understand humor, we can use it to keep them on their toes," Ryland explained. "Confuse them, buy us some time." Stratham considered this, tapping a finger against his chin. "Unorthodox. But it might work, plus, if all else fails, we've got Griggs here," Ryland added, clapping the first mate on the back. "He's a real clown." Griggs gave a theatrical bow. "At your service." Stratham's lips twitched, almost a smile. "Very well. But if this fails, you'll be explaining it to the Central Command." "Wouldn't miss it for the universe," Ryland said with a wink. As they headed back to the ship, Ryland let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. "Well, that went better than expected." "Yeah," Alara agreed. "I think he actually cracked a smile there." Griggs shook his head, or had gas. "Hard to tell with guys like him," Ryland chuckled. "Either way, we've got a chance. Let's make the most of it." Back on the ship, Ryland gathered the crew in the mess, a space that smelled faintly of burnt coffee and unwashed socks. "All right, folks, here's the deal. We've got this thing with humor, right?" "Right," Alara said, nodding along. "So let's give the Kragari something to laugh at. They'll never see it coming, or they'll just shoot us," Griggs muttered. "Always the optimist, Griggs," Ryland said, clapping him on the shoulder. "Look, it's crazy, but it's what we've got. And if it works, maybe we'll come out of this with more than just a story." Alara grinned. "Like enough credits for a new ship or a round of drinks," Griggs added. Ryland laughed. "All right, crew. Let's give him a show." With that, they set to work, preparing their unorthodox defense. Griggs compiled a list of jokes so bad they might be lethal, while Alara tinkered with the ship systems to find ways to broadcast their humor on frequencies the Kragari might pick up. Ryland watched them work, a sense of pride swelling in his chest. They might be a ragtag bunch of misfits, but they were his ragtag bunch of misfits. And if they couldn't outgun the Kragari, damn it, they'd outwit them. "Hey, Ryland," Alara called from her station. "How do you fix a broken tuba?" Ryland shrugged. "I give up with a tuba glue," Alara replied, grinning. Ryland groaned, but he couldn't help but smile. "That's terrible. But it just might save our skins." As the ship hummed along, carrying them toward an uncertain future, Ryland couldn't shake the feeling that they might just pull this off. They were flying by the seat of their pants, pretty much their default setting, but they were doing it together. And maybe, just maybe, they'd come out the other side with their lives, their ship, and enough stores to last a lifetime, or at least until the next disaster came knocking. The Sanctum Spire loomed ahead, a tangled mess of architecture that seemed like an insult to logic and a challenge to navigation. It was the kind of place that made you question your sanity just for setting foot inside. And here they were, about to delve even deeper into its mysteries. Because, of course, things had gone predictably awry. "Well, this is a shitstorm," Ryland muttered as he stared at the ship's console, which now whined with a new, more irritating tone, a bit like a cat with a hangover. The Kragari had adapted to their humor offensive quicker than a drunk at an open bar. Their last attempt at a knock-knock joke had been met with a rather impolite laser barrage. "Adaptable bastards," Griggs grumbled, scratching his beard with the enthusiasm of a man determined to relocate some of his filth. "They've figured out we were just trying to screw with their heads." "Yeah," Alara sighed, her eyes on the cube as if willing it to spill its secrets. "They are learning, which means we need to figure out what this thing actually does." Rylan rubbed his temples, feeling a headache brewing that promised to be a real masterpiece. All right, new plan, we're going deeper into the Sanctum Spire. If the answers aren't here, then they're probably somewhere in that architectural nightmare. Ilara nodded, though her frown suggested she'd rather be anywhere else. Sure, why not? Nothing says fun afternoon like getting lost in a labyrinth built by a lunatic. Pack your maps and a rope, Griggs added, and maybe a stiff drink. As they geared up, Rylan felt a strange mix of dread and determination. The Kragari were closing in, and if they didn't find a way to use the cube soon, they'd be as useful as a chocolate teapot in hell. The airlock hissed open, and the three of them stepped into the spire, its corridors twisting away in every conceivable direction, some of which didn't seem physically possible. So, any idea where we're going? Griggs asked, looking around like a lost tourist. Not a clue, Rylan admitted. But if I were a secret to the universe, I'd probably be somewhere in the basement. Right? Ilara said dryly. Because that makes perfect sense. Got a better idea? She shook her head. No. But then again, I'm not the one who talks to inanimate objects expecting them to answer. They picked a corridor at random, stepping over debris that looked suspiciously like pieces of previous explorers who'd gotten a bit too curious. The walls buzzed with an energy that was both unsettling and intriguing, like the hum of a fridge that might be plotting against you. So, what's the deal with this cube anyway? Griggs asked as they walked, his fingers tracing the edges of the mysterious object. Besides being a comedy critic, Ilara hesitated, her fingers drumming on her data pad. It's not just a relic, she finally said. It's more like an amplifier. It taps into human traits like humor and cranks them up to 11. Great, Griggs said. So we've got a cosmic megaphone for dad jokes. That'll scare him. Rylan shot him a look. If we amplify the right traits, it might just give us an edge. Maybe there's more to this thing than we thought. Maybe, Ilara agreed, a hint of hope in her voice. There must be a way to channel it. As they descended a spiral staircase that seemed to defy gravity, Rylan couldn't help but marvel at the sheer insanity of it all. The spire wasn't just a structure. It was a riddle wrapped in a mystery, dipped in confusion, and served with a side of cosmic weirdness. They reached a large chamber at the base of the spire, its walls lined with alien technology that looked suspiciously like the kind of thing that could either save them or blow them to smithereens. Probably both. Looks promising, Ilara said, her eyes wide as she scanned the room. Or at least less likely to kill us than the last one. Rylan approached a console that looked slightly more coherent than the rest, its surface covered in glowing symbols that pulsed in time with the cube, now snug in his palm. Looks like it's interacting with the place. Maybe there's a way to boost its power, or turn it into a bomb, Griggs suggested helpfully. Let's try and keep the explosions to a minimum, Rylan replied, his fingers dancing over the alien controls. I like the ship with all its bits attached. Ilara joined him, her eyes narrowed in concentration as she worked her magic. There's a resonance here, she murmured, like it's speaking to the spire. If we can tune it, then what? Griggs demanded, looking between them. It's not like we're gonna turn into superheroes. Well, no, Rylan said. But maybe we can turn into something the Kragari aren't expecting. He glanced at the cube, which was now shimmering with an intensity that promised either salvation or a spectacularly messy death. It was a 50-50 shot, but then again, when wasn't it? As they tinkered with the console, the room began to hum, a deep, reverberating sound that vibrated through the floor and into their bones. It was the kind of noise that promised change, one way or another. Got it, Ilara exclaimed, a triumphant note in her voice. We're linked to the spire. It's amplifying our essence, Griggs frowned. Essence? Yeah, Rylan said, grinning like a man who just found the last beer in the fridge. Our human traits. Humor, creativity, unpredictability. All the stuff the Kragari can't handle. The room's hum grew louder, and Rylan could almost feel the cube's power coursing through him, a wild, untamed force that spoke to the chaos of humanity itself. It was exhilarating and terrifying in equal measure. "All right," he said, feeling the weight of the moment. "Let's give those Kragari a show they'll never forget." With the Spire's power behind them, they returned to the ship, ready to face the Kragari with a newfound confidence. It wasn't just about jokes anymore. It was about tapping into the essence of what made them human, using their quirks and flaws as weapons in a war of wits. The ship shuddered as they took off, the Kragari vessels looming on the horizon like storm clouds ready to unleash their fury. Rylan took a deep breath, feeling the cube's energy thrumming in his veins. "All right, crew," he said, his voice steady. "Let's put on a show." As the Kragari ships closed in, Rylan felt the power of the Spire flowing through him, a wild symphony of chaos and creativity that was as unpredictable as a drunk on a unicycle. He smiled, a wicked grin that promised trouble. "Hey, Kragari," he broadcast, his voice echoing through the cosmos. "What's the deal with spaceship food?" The response was immediate, a barrage of Kragari projectiles that lit up the void like fireworks on a disappointing New Year's Eve. But Rylan just laughed, feeling the power of the cube amplifying his words, twisting them into something that echoed back at the Kragari in a way they couldn't comprehend. "What's the matter?" he continued. Afraid of a little human creativity, the Kragari ships hesitated, their formations faltering as the amplified essence of humanity crashed into them like a rogue wave. It was chaos, and it was beautiful. Griggs watched the spectacle unfold, a look of disbelief on his face. "I can't believe this is working." Ilara grinned, her eyes sparkling with the thrill of the moment. "Of course it's working. We're using what they fear most, human unpredictability." The Kragari ships were in disarray, their sensors overwhelmed by the barrage of amplified chaos. It was as if the very essence of humanity had become a weapon, and the Kragari had no defense against it. "All right, let's wrap this up," Rylan said, feeling the power of the cube begin to wane. "We've given them enough to think about for one day." With a final flourish, he disengaged the cube's power, the ship's engines roaring as they made their escape. The Kragari ships were left behind, reeling from the unexpected assault, their sensors struggling to make sense of the chaos they'd just encountered. As the stars streaked past, Rylan let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. They'd done it. Against all odds, they'd turned the tables on the Kragari using nothing more than the essence of what made them human. "Not bad for a bunch of misfits," Griggs said, his voice tinged with admiration. Ilara nodded, her expression one of satisfaction. "We might just make it out of this after all." Rylan smiled, feeling the weight of the cube in his hand. It was a relic, a weapon, a conduit for the very things that made them who they were, and it had just given them a fighting chance. "All right, crew," he said, his voice filled with renewed confidence. "Let's get the hell out of here and figure out what else this thing can do." As the ship soared into the unknown, Rylan couldn't help but feel a sense of hope. Hope that maybe, just maybe, they'd found a way to survive in a universe that seemed hell-bent on tearing them apart. For now, though, they'd earned a moment of respite, a chance to catch their breath and prepare for whatever came next. Because if there was one thing Rylan knew, it was that the universe had a way of throwing curveballs when you least expected them. And they'd just become very, very good at hitting those out of the park. As the ship cruised through the void, a pocket of uneasy silence settled in around Captain Voss and his motley crew. It was the kind of silence that suggested everyone was busy with their thoughts, probably wondering if they'd just used up a lifetime supply of luck. Rylan could almost hear the gears turning in their heads, or maybe that was just the ship's engine, which currently sounded like a discontented walrus with a cold. "We really did that, didn't we?" Griggs finally said, breaking the spell as he scratched at his perpetually itchy beard. The man looked more like a bear than a first mate. "Yeah, we did," Rylan replied, leaning back in his chair with a grin. "And we didn't even blow up. I'd call that a win." Ilara was still glued to her data pad, fingers dancing over its surface like a pianist mid-recital. The Kragari won't be down for long, she warned, not bothering to look up. They're quick learners, especially when it comes to things they don't understand. Great, Rylan sighed. We've given them a crash course in human nonsense. What could possibly go wrong? Griggs chuckled, a deep, gravelly sound that was somehow reassuring in its familiarity. At least we got a few good shots in. Nothing like a punchline to the solar plexus to make a point. Rylan shook his head, trying to shake the growing sense of dread. Sure, they'd bought themselves some time, but the Kragari wouldn't stay confused forever. And they were still out there, lurking like a bad hangover waiting to strike. All right, folks, Rylan said, trying to rally his crew. We need to figure out how to use this cube for more than just a stand-up routine. Suggestions? Ilara finally looked up, her expression thoughtful. We know it amplifies human traits. Humor's just the start. There's got to be more we can tap into, like what? Griggs asked. Sarcasm? Cynicism? Last I checked, those aren't exactly weapons grade. Maybe, Ilara said, a hint of a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. But unpredictability is. We just have to think outside the box, or inside the cube, as it were. Rylan felt a spark of inspiration flicker to life. Right. So we use it to amplify all the traits the Kragari can't handle. Confusion, chaos, creativity. The stuff that makes us impossible to predict. Griggs nodded slowly, as if the idea was just starting to make sense. Turn their own order against them. I like it. But how do we do that without frying ourselves in the process? Ilara's fingers resumed their dance across the data pad, her mind racing. We need to link the ship systems to the cube. Synchronize everything so we can control the output. That way we can direct the chaos where we need it. Won't that just make everything more likely to explode? Griggs asked, a note of skepticism in his voice. Probably, Ilara admitted, but if we're careful, we might just survive it. The key is finding the right balance. Rylan considered the plan, weighing the risks against the potential reward. It was madness, pure and simple. But then again, isn't that what they'd signed up for? The universe didn't play by the rules, so why should they? All right, he said, decision made. Let's give it a shot. Ilara, see what you can do with the systems. Griggs, make sure the ship doesn't fall apart in the process. We're going to need all the help we can get. As Ilara and Griggs set to work, Rylan felt the familiar tension of impending disaster settle in around him. It was like standing on the edge of a precipice, knowing that any moment could bring either salvation or a plummet to certain doom. The ship's console continued its incessant hum, a constant reminder of their precarious situation. Rylan resisted the urge to give it a good whack, knowing that violence against inanimate objects rarely solved anything. Well, except maybe printer jams. Hey, Cap, Griggs called from across the bridge, his voice tinged with exasperation. You sure this box of tricks won't turn us into something the Kragari would actually find funny? I damn well hope not, Rylan replied, though the thought had crossed his mind. Just keep an eye on the systems and make sure nothing starts smoking that shouldn't be. Right, because we want all our smoking confined to illicit substances, Griggs quipped, earning a chuckle from Ilara. The minutes ticked by, each one feeling like an eternity as Ilara worked her magic, the ship's systems gradually syncing with the cube's mysterious power. The air was thick with anticipation, as if they were all holding their breath, waiting for something to happen. I think I've got it, Ilara finally announced, her voice tinged with both relief and apprehension. We're synced. The cube's energy is flowing through the ship systems. All right, Rylan said, feeling that familiar mix of excitement and dread. Let's see what this baby can do. It didn't take long for the Kragari to find them again. Their ships appeared on the sensors like a swarm of angry bees, buzzing with a relentless determination that was nothing short of terrifying. Here they come, Griggs said, eyeing the screen warily. They look pissed. Good, Rylan replied, a wicked grin spreading across his face. Let's give them something to really get steamed about. With a series of deft commands, Rylan activated the cube's power, channeling its chaos through the ship systems. The effect was immediate. an unpredictable surge of energy that rippled through the ship and into the void beyond. "Hold on to your hats," Ilara warned as the ship lurched, the energy coursing through it like an electric storm. "This is going to get bumpy." The Kragari ships hesitated, their sensors struggling to make sense of the chaos that surrounded them. It was like trying to navigate a hurricane with a broken compass, and the Kragari were clearly feeling the strain. "Let's see how they like a little unpredictability," Rylan muttered, adjusting the controls to send another wave of chaotic energy out into the void. The Kragari ships faltered, their formations breaking apart as they tried to regroup. It was like watching a meticulously arranged domino display topple under the weight of its own precision. "Looks like it's working," Griggs said, his voice tinged with disbelief. "They can't handle the chaos." Ilara nodded, a triumphant gleam in her eye. "We're using their own strength against them. They're so focused on order, they can't cope with this level of unpredictability." Rylan felt a surge of hope, a spark of defiance that had been missing for far too long. They were doing it, actually turning the tide against the Kragari, using nothing more than the essence of what made them human. But even as they celebrated their small victory, Rylan knew it wouldn't last. The Kragari were quick learners, and it was only a matter of time before they found a way to counter the chaos. "All right, let's not get cocky," he cautioned, his voice cutting through the air like a knife. "We've got them on the back foot, but we need to stay sharp. They'll adapt if we give them the chance." Ilara nodded, her focus unwavering. "I'll keep the systems balanced. As long as we maintain the chaos, we've got the upper hand." Griggs grinned, a wicked glint in his eye. "And if they do adapt, we'll just have to find a new way to mess with them. It's what humans do best, after all." Rylan couldn't help but chuckle at that. It was true. Humans were nothing if not adaptable, a species defined by their ability to survive in the face of overwhelming odds. As the Kragari ships continued to flounder, Rylan felt a sense of pride swell within him. They were holding their own, using the very traits that made them human to turn the tables on an enemy that had underestimated them. For now, at least, they had the upper hand. But Rylan knew better than to rest on his laurels. The universe was a harsh mistress, full of surprises and setbacks, and they'd need every ounce of cunning and creativity to make it through. "All right, folks," he said, his voice steady and sure. "We've bought ourselves some time. Let's use it wisely." As the ship sailed through the chaos, Rylan allowed himself a moment of reflection. They were up against impossible odds, trapped in a universe that seemed determined to chew them up and spit them out. Yet here they were, fighting back with little more than their wits and the mysterious power of a cube they barely understood. It was madness, glorious, exhilarating madness. And in that madness, Rylan found a glimmer of hope. Because if they could navigate this chaos, who knew what else they might achieve? As the stars streaked past, Rylan felt a renewed sense of purpose. They were misfits, outcasts, a ragtag crew that had no business surviving in a universe full of dangers and uncertainties. But they had each other and they had the cube. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. For now, though, they'd continue to fight, continue to adapt, continue to defy the odds. Because if there was one thing Rylan had learned, it was that humanity had a knack for surviving the impossible. And as long as they had that, they stood a chance. The great cosmic joke, Rylan Voss mused, was that the universe didn't have a sense of humor, but that didn't stop him from trying to force-feed it some. Currently, it seemed, the Kragari were the punchline, and Rylan wasn't about to let them forget it. "All right, Ilara," Rylan said, turning to their tech-savvy savior, who was tapping away on her data pad like it owed her money. "Any chance we can crank this thing up to 11? Ilara didn't bother looking up. "Cranking it to 11 might implode the ship. I'd rather not get scattered across the universe, thanks." "Fair point," Rylan conceded, spinning his chair back to face the bridge's flickering console. It was humming like a dying cat, which was strangely appropriate considering how close they'd come to getting skinned alive by the Kragari. Griggs, who had been loitering near the back with an air of someone who thinks they might have left the toaster on at home, scratched at his beard, which had achieved a level of grime that could only be described as sentient. "You sure this is gonna work?" he asked, skepticism oozing from his every pore. "Because the last time we tried something crazy, I ended up with a rash," Ryland smirked. "That wasn't from the mission, Griggs. That was from that dancer on Titan." "Yeah, well," Griggs muttered, "she promised that cream would clear it right up." "Focus, gentlemen," Elara interjected, though there was a hint of amusement in her eyes. "The chaos field is holding, but if those aliens get wise to our tricks, we'll all be space dust." Ryland cracked his knuckles, trying not to think about the Kragari ships clambering back into formation. "Then we better get creative. What's the most absurd thing we can throw at them? Jokes about their mothers," Griggs offered. "Tempting, but I doubt they'll get it," Ryland said. "Besides, humor isn't universal. Remember, the Kragari think irony is just something you use to dewrinkle clothes." Elara cut in again, her fingers never pausing on the data pad. "Maybe we don't need to be funny, just unpredictable. Hit them with something so strange they won't know what to do, like your taste in socks," Griggs asked, glancing at the luridly colored argyle patterns peeking from beneath Ryland's trousers. Ryland shook his head, grinning. "Exactly. Let's sock it to them." From the way Elara's eyes glittered, Ryland could tell she was cooking up something devious. "What if we use the cube to amplify our ship's signal? Broadcast something completely nonsensical to mess with their sensors, like the top 100 worst songs of the 21st century. Griggs suggested. "Bingo," Ryland said. "If they don't retreat, they'll at least be too busy trying to figure out how to make it stop." Elara gave a slight nod of approval. "I can rig the systems to transmit. We'll turn this ship into the universe's worst DJ booth. Just how I always wanted to go out," Griggs said, rolling his eyes. "Death by bad karaoke." The ship shuddered as Elara set to work, the cube's energy humming along with the console. Ryland felt the vibrations through his bones, each tremor a reminder of how close they were skating to the edge. He glanced at the screen, watching the Kragari ships struggle to regain their footing. They were like ants running around trying to rebuild their hill after a particularly rude kid had kicked it over. "Let's see how well they handle boy bands from the 2000s, Ryland muttered, tapping a command that sent the cacophonous symphony out into the void. The effect was almost immediate. The Kragari formations wobbled, their ships teetering as conflicting signals bombarded their systems. Ryland imagined the alien captains slapping their consoles, trying to comprehend the sudden onslaught of musical nonsense. "They're trying to regroup," Elara warned, her brow furrowed in concentration. "We need to keep them off balance." "Griggs, how's our power holding?" Ryland called, his gaze locked on the screen. "Like a drunk on a unicycle," Griggs replied. "We've got enough juice to keep this up for a bit, but don't expect any miracles." "Never do," Ryland said. "Let's keep the pressure on. Hit them with the next track." As the ship's systems shuddered to comply, Ryland marveled at their audacity. Here they were, humans in a tin can, defying an advanced alien race with a mixtape and a piece of ancient tech they barely understood. It was either brilliant or insane. Probably both. "Admiral Stratham's never gonna believe this," Ryland mused aloud. "If we survive, he'll have to," Elara said, her lips quirking in a wry smile. "And if we don't, well, at least we'll go down in history as the crew that died for the cause of bad music." "Not exactly the legacy I was hoping for," Griggs grumbled. "Could be worse," Ryland said. "We could be the crew that died because Griggs couldn't keep his pants on." "Hey!" Griggs protested, though he couldn't suppress a chuckle. "That was one time too many," Elara chimed in, her eyes never leaving the screen. "The Kragari are adapting. We need to up the ante." "Suggestions?" Ryland asked. "I'm working on a hack," Elara said, tapping even faster. "If I can send them a feedback loop through their own systems, it'll amplify the chaos tenfold." "Sounds risky," Ryland noted. "Risky is our middle name," Griggs pointed out. "And here I thought it was unemployed," Ryland shot back. "Settle down, children," Elara said, smirking. "I've got the loop ready. Just need the captain's go-ahead. Rylan didn't hesitate. Do it. Ilara's fingers danced over the console, the ship's lights flickering as the system strained under the load. Outside, the Kragari ships flickered too, their orderly lines dissolving into a mess worthy of a toddler's first attempt at macaroni art. Seems like their comedy skills are about as good as their combat tactics, Rylan observed. Yeah, but they're catching on, Griggs said, his finger tapping an anxious rhythm on the console. We need to keep this up or we're toast. Rylan felt the weight of Griggs's words settle over him. The stakes were absurdly high, the kind of stakes that made you laugh just to keep from screaming. But there was no turning back. Not now. All right, Ilara, he said. Give it everything we've got. You got it, Captain, Ilara replied, a determined gleam in her eye. The ship lurched as the cube's energy coursed through its veins, the chaos intensifying. The Kragari ships were now a tangled mess, a ballet of confusion that would have been beautiful if it wasn't so deadly. Rylan watched the chaos unfold, his heart pounding a rhythm as erratic as the energy they were unleashing. They were taking the fight to the Kragari, defying the odds with nothing more than grit and a bit of gallows humor. We're holding, Griggs said, his voice a mix of disbelief and relief. Barely, but we're holding. Good, Rylan said, feeling a flicker of hope. Let's keep it that way. Ilara was a blur of motion, her fingers never still as she orchestrated the chaos like some demented symphony conductor. If we can keep this up for just a little longer, they might give up and go home, or they'll get smart and start using earplugs, Griggs muttered. Rylan shook his head. Let's hope they're too stubborn for that. The Kragari ships continued their clumsy dance, and for a moment, Rylan dared to believe they might actually pull this off. But hope was a dangerous thing, easily dashed by the harsh reality of space. As the ship's systems groaned under the strain, Rylan felt the creeping fingers of doubt tugging at his mind. They'd bought themselves some time, but how long before their luck ran out? Stay sharp, everyone, he warned. We're not out of the woods yet. Ilara nodded, her expression grim. I'll keep us running as long as I can. Won't be much longer, Griggs added. We're running on fumes here. Rylan glanced at the screen, watching as the Kragari ship struggled to adapt. They were clever, he'd give them that. But humans had survived worse odds than this. Just a little longer, he murmured, more to himself than anyone else. The ship trembled as Ilara pushed it to its limits, the energy crackling like static electricity ready to zap anyone who dared touch it. Rylan could almost taste the tension in the air, a cocktail of fear and determination that hung around them like an invisible fog. Here they come again, Griggs said, his voice a low growl. They're not giving up. Rylan clenched his fists, steeling himself for the next wave. Then neither are we. The Kragari ship surged forward, a last-ditch effort to crush the resistance they couldn't comprehend. Rylan felt the weight of their determination, an oppressive force pressing down on them, threatening to snuff out their hopes like a candle in a hurricane. But there was a spark within him, a defiant flame that refused to be extinguished. They'd come this far against all odds. Why stop now? Let's give them one hell of a show, Rylan said, his voice steady despite the chaos. Ilara nodded, her focus unwavering. On it, Captain. Together, they watched as their plan unfolded, a tapestry of madness that defied logic and reason. The Kragari ships wavered, their resolve tested as their systems screamed in protest. Looks like they're running out of steam, Griggs observed, a note of triumph in his voice. Good, Rylan said. Let's make sure they don't forget this. As the chaos reached its peak, Rylan felt a thrill of exhilaration, the kind that came from defying the universe and living to tell the tale. They'd faced the impossible, and against all odds they'd turned the tables. But the game wasn't over yet. The Kragari were nothing if not persistent, and Rylan knew they'd be back. For now, though, they'd won a reprieve, a moment of respite in the endless battle against the unknown. And as Rylan surveyed the chaos they'd unleashed, he couldn't help but smile. Because in the end, it wasn't about the odds or the outcome. It was about the fight, the defiance, the refusal to go quietly into the night. And that, Rylan thought, was something worth fighting for. The Sanctum Spire loomed in the distance like a deranged architect's fever dream, a place where right angles went to die and up was a matter of personal opinion. But right now, Rylan Voss had bigger problems. He glanced at Alara, who was still hammering away at her data pad like it owed her money. "We about to make history or a footnote in some bureaucrat's report?" Rylan asked, voice laced with all the optimism of a funeral director ordering extra black. Alara didn't look up. "Depends. Do you want the version where we save the day or the one where we explode in a blaze of ironic glory?" "I'll take the former, with a side of not dying," Rylan said. Griggs grunted from his station, scratching at his beard which could have been hiding a small ecosystem for all Rylan knew. "We're not exactly spoilt for choice here, Cap. The Kragari are about as persistent as a bad rash," Rylan snorted. "You would know about bad rashes, Griggs." "Hey, that was one time and the medical bay was out of cream," Griggs retorted, feigning hurt. Enough about Griggs' questionable personal hygiene. Alara cut in, her voice the only thing sharper than her wit. "Time to unleash the full potential of the cube." Rylan nodded, watching as the cube sat serenely in its chamber, a glowing enigma of ancient tech ready to dropkick the Kragari back to irrelevance. If humor was humanity's secret weapon, they were about to go nuclear. "Let's see if the universe is ready for the comedy stylings of Earth," Rylan said, flipping a switch. The ship's systems roared to life, the console humming with the kind of energy that would have made even a dying cat perk up and take notice. The cube amplified their broadcast, sending out a torrent of human absurdity across the stars. The Kragari ships shuddered visibly, their sleek designs spasming as the cacophony hit. Rylan imagined the alien captains recoiling, confronted by a wall of sound that blended the philosophical musings of stand-up comics with the unholy annoyance of bagpipes. "Looks like they are feeling the heat," Alara said, a spark of mischief in her eyes. Griggs leaned back, arms crossed over his chest. "And here I thought they didn't have a sense of humor." "Oh, they've got one all right," Rylan replied, grinning despite the tension. "It's called Let's See How Fast We Can Run Away." The alien fleet was a mess, ships careening into each other like drunken revelers at a festival for the terminally uncoordinated. It was an almost poetic chaos, a ballet of failure choreographed by desperation and bewilderment. Rylan's gaze flicked to the screen, watching the Kragari ships struggling to maintain any semblance of order. "Any sign they're calling it quits?" Alara shook her head, though a smile tugged at her lips. "Not yet, but they're thinking about it." "Good," Rylan said. "Keep it up. We'll make comedians of them yet." As Alara worked her magic, Griggs leaned closer, a shadow of concern lurking behind his usual bravado. "Think this'll actually work, Rylan?" Rylan shrugged, trying to ignore the gnawing doubt in his gut. "I've bet on worse odds, yeah, like when you thought Griggs could beat me in a poker game," Alara chimed in, her fingers dancing over the console. "That was one time." Griggs protested, though his lopsided grin said he wasn't too offended. Rylan chuckled, the tension easing for a moment. All right. Enough strolls down memory lane. Let's focus on the task at hand." Outside, the Kragari fleet was unraveling, their attempts to regroup undercut by the sheer unpredictability of the human broadcast. The humor offensive was doing its job, pulling the rug out from under the aliens' collective feet. "Never thought bad jokes would save my life," Griggs mused, scratching his beard again. "I always figured they'd get me killed." "Don't worry," Alara said, a twinkle in her eye. "There's still time for that." The ship thrummed with energy, the cube's power crackling through every circuit. It was a symphony of controlled chaos, each note a reminder of just how close they were skating to the edge. But that was where the best stories were made, Rylan thought. Right on the precipice, with nothing but audacity and a bad punchline to keep you from falling. "All right, let's wrap this up," Rylan said, his voice steady and commanding. "Time to show them why humans are the kings of improv." Ilara's fingers flew, a blur of calculated chaos that sent the final wave of humor crashing into the Kragari. It was a 1-2 punch of slapstick and satire, the kind of thing that would have left even the most seasoned human audiences in stitches. The alien ships wobbled, their formations dissolving into a jumble of confusion. For a moment, it was beautiful in its absurdity, a testament to the power of laughter in a universe that often took itself far too seriously. "Looks like they're backing off," Griggs noted, a note of awe in his voice. "I'll be damned, don't get too comfortable," Rylan warned. "They're still out there," Ilara nodded, her smile tempered by caution. "But for now, we've given them something to think about." Rylan watched as the Kragari ships retreated, their shapes growing smaller as they vanished into the depths of space. It wasn't quite a victory, but it was close enough to taste. "We did it," he said softly, a smile spreading across his face. "Yeah, we did," Griggs agreed, his usual skepticism replaced by a rare moment of genuine satisfaction. Ilara leaned back, exhaustion finally catching up with her. "Let's just hope they don't come back with a new appreciation for terrible jokes." Rylan laughed, the sound surprisingly light in the aftermath of chaos. "If they do, we'll cross that bridge when we get there. For now, let's just enjoy the quiet." The crew settled into a moment of silence, each of them savoring the unexpected triumph they'd managed to pull off. It was a victory built on humor and unpredictability, a defiant reminder that sometimes the best way to fight back was with a smile. "All right, folks," Rylan said, breaking the silence with a clap of his hands. "Let's get back to work. We've got a lot of repairs to make, and sooner or later Admiral Stratham's going to want an explanation." Ilara groaned, though her eyes sparkled with amusement. "And what exactly are we going to tell him?" Rylan shrugged, the motion easy and unburdened. "The truth, more or less. We blasted the Kragari with a wall of sound and made them reconsider their life choices." "You know, the usual." Griggs chuckled, shaking his head. "Can't wait to see the look on his face." "Me neither," Rylan admitted, the prospect of recounting their escapades to the fleet's sternest officer almost as daunting as the confrontation with the Kragari had been. But that was a problem for tomorrow. For now, Rylan was content to bask in the knowledge that they'd managed to pull off the impossible once again. They'd faced the unknown with nothing but their wits and a sense of humor, and they'd come out the other side intact. "Well done, everyone," he said, his voice warm with genuine pride. "We might be a ragtag bunch of misfits, but we're damn good at what we do." Ilara raised an eyebrow, a hint of teasing in her gaze. "Even Griggs." "Hey, I resemble that remark," Griggs shot back, though his grin was as wide as any of theirs. Rylan laughed again, the sound ringing out through the bridge. It was the laughter of relief, of triumph, of camaraderie forged in the fires of adversity. It was the sound of humanity, in all its flawed glory, standing tall against the odds. And as the ship sailed through the stars, the Sanctum Spire fading into the distance, Rylan knew that whatever came next, they'd face it together. With a smirk, a wisecrack, and the kind of resolve that could only come from knowing you'd stared into the abyss and refused to blink. In the end, it wasn't about the technology or the tactics or even the odds. It was about the people, the connections, the shared moments of madness that made every risk worth taking. "All right, let's get back to work," Rylan said, his tone light and easy. "We've got a universe to antagonize." And with that, they set to the task of rebuilding, confident in the knowledge that whatever challenges lay ahead, they'd face them with the same irreverent bravado that had seen them through this one. Because in a universe that often forgot how to laugh, they'd found their strength in the most unlikely of places. And that, Rylan thought with a smile, was the real victory. The ship, held together by a miracle of duct tape and optimism, was unusually quiet. The Kragari's retreat was a sweet symphony to Rylan Voss's ears. Authoritarian aliens fleeing in disarray was the kind of sight that warmed the cold, shriveled core of even the most jaded spacefarer's heart. "Well," Rylan said, breaking the hush, "I think we've proven once and for all that there's nothing a little human absurdity can't solve." Griggs, still scratching at his beard, grinned. raises the question of what happens when they come back with a comedy coach and a Netflix special. Ilara, lounging with the data pad she'd been glued to since the beginning of this fiasco, gave a dry chuckle. Maybe they'll bring some fresh material next time. Lord knows we've run through all the classics. The console flickered ominously, like a dying light bulb in a horror movie. Rylan gave it a gentle pat, as if to say, "Not today, old friend." They still had to make it out of this mess before the ship decided to pick new and exciting ways to fall apart. "All right, crew," Rylan declared, standing up and stretching his back with a satisfying crack. "Let's wrap this up. We've got a universe convinced we're the comedic geniuses of the cosmos. Let's not disappoint." Griggs nodded, though his expression was somewhere between skepticism and outright disbelief. "What's next, Cap?" "We going on a galaxy-wide stand-up tour. Keep that beard of yours away from open mics and maybe," Rylan shot back, smirking. Meanwhile, Ilara was tapping away on her data pad with the intensity of a gambler on a hot streak. "I'm just hoping this little adventure doesn't end with us on some alien talk show. I hear the Kragari have a taste for public ridicule. Better than being blasted into space dust, right?" Rylan replied. "I'd rather face a heckler than a plasma cannon any day." The notion of a future filled with alien critique was oddly comforting. If they were still thinking about the Kragari tomorrow, it meant they'd survived. It was a small victory, but a victory nonetheless. As they secured the cube, making sure it was snugly fitted into its chamber, Rylan couldn't help but reflect on how far they'd come. A ragtag team of misfits cobbled together by fate, or perhaps sheer cosmic indifference, had gone toe-to-toe with one of the galaxy's most feared adversaries, and won in their own unconventional way. "Got the cube all strapped in, Cap," Griggs said, slapping the side of the chamber with a satisfied nod. "Nice and secure." "Good," Rylan replied, feeling a swell of something dangerously close to pride. "Let's hope this keeps the Kragari off our backs for a while." Ilara leaned back in her chair, looking more relaxed than Rylan had ever seen her. "Think we'll get a commendation from Admiral Stratham for this?" Rylan snorted. "Sure. Right after we explain how our top-secret weapon is essentially a cosmic whoopee cushion." "Sounds like a plan," Griggs chimed in, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "I'm sure the Admiral will love that." The aftermath of their victory was a strange blend of relief and uncertainty. They'd done the impossible. They'd turned the tide against an enemy that had seemed unstoppable. But what next? Where did a crew go after pulling off the biggest cosmic joke in history? "Guess we're legends now," Rylan mused, looking around at his crew. "The kind of story they tell over drinks in some dive bar on the edge of known space." Ilara grinned, her sharp wit cutting through the momentary solemnity. "Legends, huh? I always thought I'd end up as a cautionary tale." Griggs chuckled. "As long as they remember us as more than just the smelly guy with the beard, I'm good with whatever version gets told." The ship hummed along, a symphony of mechanical groans and squeaks that had somehow become comforting over the years. It was a reminder that they were still alive, still defying the odds in a universe that seemed hell-bent on snuffing them out. "All right, legends," Rylan said, clapping his hands together. "Let's figure out what's next. I've got a feeling the universe isn't done with us yet." Ilara shrugged, still tapping away with a focus that would have put a laser beam to shame. "Once we've got this rust bucket patched up, I say we head somewhere with real drinks and less alien hostility." "Sounds like a plan," Griggs agreed, then paused, sniffing the air. "And maybe somewhere with showers that don't threaten to fillet you alive." Rylan laughed, the sound echoing around the bridge like a promise of things to come. "I'll put it on the list, right above a void getting obliterated by aliens." Their journey was far from over, but they'd won a reprieve, a chance to catch their breath, to regroup and plan their next move. They'd faced the abyss and laughed in its face, a defiant reminder that humanity wasn't done yet. Rylan leaned back, letting the moment wash over him. Victory tasted different than he'd expected, less sweet, more bittersweet, tempered by the knowledge that they'd only bought themselves time. But in a world as unpredictable as theirs, time was a precious commodity. "Here's to the next adventure," Ryland said, raising an imaginary glass. "May it be as ridiculous and improbable as this one." "Cheers to that," Ilara replied, joining the toast with a smirk. "And to not getting ourselves killed in the process." "Always a bonus," Griggs added, leaning back with a satisfied sigh. They'd come a long way, this motley crew of misfits and dreamers. They'd faced down the worst the universe had to offer and lived to tell the tale. And whatever came next, they'd face it together, with a smirk, a wisecrack, and the kind of resolve that could only come from staring death in the face and refusing to blink. Ryland leaned forward, his fingers dancing over the console as he plotted their next course. The ship groaned in response, as if protesting the very idea of yet another adventure. "Ready to see what's out there?" he asked, looking around at his crew. Ilara nodded, her eyes shining with the thrill of possibility. "Always." Griggs grinned, his usual skepticism giving way to something softer. "Wouldn't miss it for the world." And with that they set off once more into the great unknown, fueled by a shared sense of purpose and the knowledge that they'd already beaten the odds once. They were legends now, whether they liked it or not. Legends with a future as uncertain and unpredictable as the cosmos itself. But that was the thing about legends. They were always just getting started. And as long as there were adventures to be had, Ryland knew they'd find their way through the madness. Together, with humor as their guide and a universe full of possibilities waiting just beyond the horizon. "All right, folks," Ryland said, his voice steady and filled with a warmth that came from deep within. "Let's see what trouble we can stir up out there." "Can't wait," Ilara replied, her fingers poised over the data pad like a maestro ready to conduct a symphony of chaos. Griggs just chuckled, shaking his head as he settled in for the journey ahead. Here we go again. As the ship sailed through the stars, leaving the Sanctum Spire and its mysteries behind, Ryland felt a surge of hope. They'd faced the impossible and they'd won. And whatever the future held, they'd face it together, with humor, heart, and a defiant refusal to ever take the universe too seriously. Because in the end, that was the true power of humanity. The ability to laugh in the face of the absurd, to find joy in the chaos, and to forge a path through the darkness with nothing but humor and hope as their guide. And as their ship drifted onward, a lone vessel amidst the endless expanse of space, Ryland knew with absolute certainty that they'd find their way. No matter what lay ahead, they'd face it together, and they'd do it with a smile. Because in a universe that often forgot how to laugh, they were the reminder it needed, a ragtag crew of legends, ready to take on whatever the cosmos dared to throw their way. And with that, Ryland set their course for the unknown, a place where legends were born and dreams dared to become reality. "Let's get to it, team," he said, his voice carrying over the hum of the ship. "After all, we've got a universe to antagonize." And with that, they were off, ready to face whatever came next with all the irreverence and audacity they could muster. Because in the end, that was what made them truly legendary, their refusal to ever stop laughing, no matter how dark the journey became.